Today we're going to be talking about the skeletal system and a few basics around the skeletal system. Starting right here, we have the functions of the skeletal system. So the skeletal system has about 5 functions. There's protection. This includes physical, like as in the skeleton is strong against physical damage, or immunal. This is because the skeleton is actually the producer of all blood cells, which includes those white blood cells that help fight infections and things like that. Support and movement kind of go together. The skeletal system is really a system of levers that work with the muscles to move things. And again, it's support for those muscles and kind of keeps the body structurally up. And then production again, that's those blood cells. The hematopoietic tissue of the skeletal system actually creates the blood cells, including the red blood cells, the white blood cells, the thrombocytes, everything. The skeletal system is also stores all of our calcium. Calcium is important for the muscles to be able to move, as well as to be able to allow the nerves to send signals. Now, the skeletal system is organized into 2 main parts. There's the axial skeleton, this will be in black. This will be your head, skull, and spinal column. And the appendicular skeleton, which is your appendages, your arms, your legs, as well as sort of the pelvis. Now, bones are categorized into a few categories. There's long bones, as seen here. Long bones are not always long, but often are described that way because many of them are. There's also flat bones. This would be like the sternum as well as many of the bones inside your skull. But again, not every flat bone is flat, like the sternum is not flat. There's also many irregular bones. These are hard to describe, but this would be bones like the sphenoid bone or the ethmoid bone or the vertebrae that are very unique. There's also wormian bones. These are also called sutural bones. These bones just randomly appear along the sutures, usually due to genetics, and really don't have any effect, but they're just kind of there. Now, long bone physiology is based around this, right? Each of these will describe what I'm looking at. We split every long bone into essentially 2 sections. There's the epiphyses, this will be the ends of the bones, and the diaphyses, the sort of middle shaft. Inside the diaphyses, there's the medullary cavity. This is really filled with yellow bone marrow, which is just fat. On the epiphyses, you have another part which is actually spongy bone, and we call this is the hematopoietic tissue, but that is that red bone marrow that actually produces all those blood cells. Around the bone, we have the periosteum. This is a very, very thin layer that allows the bone to become thicker as we age and allow it to get stronger. And on the ends would be the sort of articular surfaces usually. These are usually made of cartilage. Flat bones are organized like this. There's the diplo in the very middle. This is the same as this red bone marrow up here on the epiphyses of the long bones. It's that red bone marrow, that hematopoietic tissue that produces those blood cells. And on the edges is the cortex, which is the really hard bone. The edge, the outer part of bones, is always compact bone, while the inside is always spongy bone. The spongy bone is porous and is usually filled with that hematopoietic tissue, or in the case of the medullary cavity, fat. Now, the surface features of bones are going to be what makes every bone unique. There's a few types. The first type is articulations. These are where bones meet together. These are the joints. Now, joints are sometimes movable, but aren't always. Right? The head and fossa. Heads are going to be those large pieces that go into a socket. It's those ball and socket joints. These are often movable and are often synovial joints. Condyles and facets. These are essentially just small heads and very shallow fossa. However, it should be noted that some fossa and facets are actually called condyles, like in the case of the tibia and the femur. And processes are sometimes articulations and sometimes non-articulations. A good example of a non-articulating process would be like the massoid process, while an articulating process could be like the styloid processes, both of which are of the temporal bone. Now, non-articulations here are a few of note. There's epicondyles, which exist on condyles. There's these little pieces here that anchor tendons, well, not tendons, but ligaments, to allow the bones to sort of stay together. There's also tubercles, trochantes, tuberosities. I would recommend just looking up what they actually look like on their actual bones, as they're very specific and they're not on every bone, but they are on some, especially on the appendages for these guys. And then there's depressions and openings. These are any sort of hole. So foramen are hole, fissures are slits, and canals are tunnels. A good example of each of these would be like the optic foramen, which is the passageway of the optic nerve. The optic fissure is the passageway of a few nerves in the eye. And an auditorial canal would be the canal of the auditorial nerve, right? That's in your ear. Now, bone develops in a few specific ways. When we become a zygote, that one cell embryo, we eventually split. All our cells undergo mitosis, and eventually they split into our epithelial tissues, our connective tissues, our muscular tissues, our nervous tissues. And when they split into those connective tissues, they further split into intramembrane, or into fibrous membranes, and cartilage, as you see with the word chondrial and the membranes, right? So bone actually develops from those membrane and those cartilage. See, as when we're a baby, we don't want full bone yet, as again, we still need to stretch and compress as we birth and as we grow. So we don't turn into bone yet. But as we grow and develop, we do eventually turn into bone, and we turn that membrane or that cartilage into bone. We're going to start with intramembranous ossification. This is actually how our flat bones are created. They're created from those membranes. This is actually the fetal skull. You'll notice there's two frontal bones. Now, in actual adult humans, and even children, there's only one frontal bone. And again, this is from a sort of top split up view to make it a little bit easier to see every single part, as if we sort of unfolded it. At each sort of main bone, or what's going to become the bone, the membrane has a primary ossification center. That's going to be denoted by these letters, so temporal bone, parietal bone, occipital, frontal bones. And then around that, it begins to ossify, essentially outside of that. There are some notable points here. These are the fontanelles. And these lines are the sutures, the solid lines. So the sutures sort of allow the brain to sort of expand as we grow, so we need to keep them. Same thing with the fontanelles, is it allows us some space for the brain to compress as it's going out the birth canal, as well as some space for the brain to grow as we're a young, a newborn developing. These eventually do solidify, and these are what we kind of consider the soft spots. This is the anterior fontanelle, which is the mostly widely known soft spot just above the forehead. And these would be the anterior and posterior lateral fontanelles. Now for the long bones are actually initially made of cartilage. So essentially we have when we're a fetus and when we're very young, we essentially have a blueprint of the bone made of cartilage. Cartilage is flexible, so we would like it because it kind of helps prevent breakage early on. But as we grow and want to turn that to bone and make it stronger and able to do all these functions, we have to go through endochondrial ossification. Now it starts off with the long bone. Blood vessels will penetrate that periosteum. Now it should be noted that that periosteum, that thickening thin edge, is actually known as the perichondrium when it's attached to the cartilage. It's a minor differentiation, but it is important. Blood vessels penetrate that perichondrium and establish a primary ossification center. These blood vessels are really just bringing in calcium. The calcium begins to ossify the surrounding cartilage and it expands towards the epiphyses. It always starts in the diaphyses. It starts at the diaphyses and spreads to the epiphyses. Then, more blood vessels are added, bringing more calcium in. These establish the secondary ossification centers in the epiphyses, and those begin to ossify and expand as well. There is a notable barrier here, though. This is commonly known as the growth plate or the epiphyseal plate. The epiphyseal plate is cartilage, and again, it allows some flexibility for the bone. However, if it's broken, it can be a big problem, as known in sort of medical cases. And as we grow into our late teens, it becomes the epiphyseal line when it becomes almost fully developed. It can fully ossify in elder years, like 60 plus, and when it does, it often leads to a decrease in flexibility. However, this is the basics of the skeletal system. Thank you for watching.